Among the many tales of tragedy and heroism on the Great Lakes, none are more famous than the wreck of the Tankanite ore hauler SS Edmund Fitzgerald on November 10th, 1975. And rightfully so, as she was the most well-known ship on the lakes. And if a ship could be a celebrity, she surely was, and her loss is still felt in the region today. Being familiar with the region myself, I was well aware of her sinking and the facts that surrounded it. Among them, repeated in media, from documentaries to newspapers, all the way to internet videos, is the assertion, which is given as a fact, that she was the last big ship to ever sink on the lakes. The lakes, which had lost ships at an alarming rate for their entire history up to that point. This, it is said, was because of changes that were made to the industry after her sinking. So imagine my surprise while researching for a book I was planning to write on the lakes and their many ghost stories, that I found out she was not in fact the last large vessel to sink beneath their waters. It all started in May of 2020, when I stumbled across an old newspaper obituary that read, Otto Frederick Carlson, age 49 of Gary, Indiana, passed away tragically on January 3rd, 1977, in the line of duty as first mate aboard the SS Jonathan Winewater, which was lost during a severe winter storm on Lake Superior. These words, they sent me on a quest to learn everything I could about the Jonathan Winewater, as it seemed to me that she had been forgotten by history, and I soon abandoned my plans to write about ghost stories at all. Learning anything other than the fact that the ship existed was surprisingly hard, but eventually I was able to put this much together. The SS Jonathan Winewater was launched in 1960, owned by the now defunct Maryland-based company Winewater International, and named for its founder. The Winewater was, in all respects, a typical ship of the period, without anything of note to set it apart. Anything, that is, except for the fact that its sinking seems to be almost deliberately ignored. Except for a handful of obituaries for the crew and a single line in an Erie, Pennsylvania newspaper, the Lakeshore Star, there was no coverage whatsoever of the tragedy. Similarly strange was that the owners, a successful and seemingly stable company, would declare bankruptcy soon after, citing the loss of a major investor in connection with the wreck. The Coast Guard had only been slightly less quiet after the accident, saying only that the ship had been found beached in two pieces on the Canadian coast and was being scrapped by the owners. When trying to find pictures of the wreck washed ashore in Canada, I found none. Why was this? I was hooked and smelled a cover-up here, so I began to dig deeper. However, after years of researching and interviewing people connected to the tragedy, I barely knew more than I had at the start. I understood the crew better, and I knew more particulars about the design of the ship. I even found a single picture of the wreck in, of all things, a tiny German-language newspaper from North Dakota, Der Prairie Zeitung. It was a small and grainy black and white shot that was taken from a cheap camera. But I knew nothing more about why the ship had sunk, what had become of the remainder of the wreck, or anything concrete with which to write a book. At most, I had a chapter. Disheartened, I gave up and moved on to new things. That is, until a chance encounter with an old acquaintance whose son was serving in the Coast Guard, where he was heading a project to modernize their archive system and transfer much of it to digital storage. That gave me an in. After a few more months of meetings and explaining the idea behind my book to various important people, I was finally given access to the archives, where I found nothing. At least at first. After 2 weeks of searching, and just when I was about to give up for a second time, I found a file at the bottom of the box that I had overlooked. It was thinner than most and slightly water damaged from improper storage, but the words on the tape still clearly read, Winewater. My heart jumped for joy when I saw that, but dropped again when I saw how little was in the folder. 2 sheets of paper and a small notebook were all it contained. The papers were both identical copies of an unusually poor quality report on the wreck, far shorter and less detailed than was usual for Coast Guard reports that told me nothing I had already not known. The small book, however, it was a pocket notebook. It was more than I ever could have bargained for. Allegedly written by the ship's cook, what follows is one of the most inexplicable accounts that I have ever read, and I post it here in the hope that someone will be able to make more sense of it than I have, or perhaps just to prove to me that it's fake, a hoax, a lie. But when the SS Jonathan Winewater left port on December 31st, 1976, it had 16 people on board, comprising of 15 crew and 1 passenger. 16 people. But if these final words of the ship's cook, Thomas Faegen, are to be believed, there were only 15 souls. The Wreck of the Jonathan Winewater by ThatAuldFool. I know I am to die, so I write this accounting of our fate so that the world might know that there are things its philosophy has never dreamed of. Things older and darker than man wishes to imagine. I am, I suppose, the captain of the bulk carrier SS Jonathan Winewater, but only by the virtue of my own Irish luck. The rest of the crew are dead, leaving me alone, the ship's cook, and all but retired to hold her helm. And hold it I shall, until my watch ends wherever I may find shore, even if they are the shores of hell. Sitting on the table next to me is a length of rope, and once I have finished penning this account, I will tie my hands to the wheel and steer her true for as long as my strength holds. And that won't be long, I fear. The pain of my broken leg is gone, and the cold, it's already sapping my strength. And I hear her calling me, the Witch of the Lakes, her banshee howl and the screaming of the wind through wires. It tells me I am damned, and I would welcome her. What better fate for a sailor than to perish with his ship? I am old and I leave no one behind to mourn me. If it weren't for the thing that I believe to be aboard, I would accept my fate with a smile, but I fear for what will happen if it gets ashore. Still, I was the cook on her maiden voyage 17 years ago, and if there is a chance, any chance, that I can still save her, I must try. If anyone should find this and read it, then I pray you will see it as more than the insane ramblings of a broken man, and you'll take it as a warning. God save you all. We left the port of Erie on New Year's Eve 1976, bound for Thunder Bay with 15 souls aboard. A skeleton crew compared to her regular complement of 29, myself a last-minute addition to the roster. I had been retired for 5 years when I received the call from Captain Leclerc, my old shipmate, asking me to cover for Teddy, the young man I had trained to replace me, what seems now a lifetime ago when I had finally left the lakes. The Winewater had to make one final unscheduled run for this season on short notice. But Teddy was getting married that weekend and could not sail. Leclerc, knowing that I loved the ship I had left behind and that I was not in the best of situations financially since my divorce, gave me a call and asked if I would take one last cruise with him on my old ship. My answer, of course, was yes. The pay was unheard of. Double pay and a potential for bonuses beyond that. But I would have sailed for free if asked. Retirement just did not suit me. I confess, I'm one of that last of the old breed of sailors whose wife is the water and whose child is the deck beneath his feet. It made me a terrible romantic and a worse husband. Worst of all, it made me happy. So, when I arrived aboard her, I asked Leclerc what we were hauling this late in the season. and his answer confused me more than not knowing would have. Our hold was to be empty except for a small load of ballast to keep her stable, and instead, we were to haul a cargo of 45 wooden boxes and not ask questions. He seemed confused as I, and anxious to be making a run this time of year. This route was never safe this late in the season. But the request had come from the owners themselves, a favor to a shareholder, he said. An aging and wealthy European, the Countess du Charme, would be coming aboard before we sailed. Now, in more than 50 years with the company, I had never heard of such a request. But still, our pay made it worth it to all aboard, and I felt the call of the lakes. Around midnight the night before we were to sail, I made my way to the galley to check our supplies and add some of the special ingredients I had brought to the refrigerator, planning to pull out all the stops and treat the crew to something truly special on this run. It only seemed right. Because I had come in so early, I was there when the cargo arrived. 2 large trucks marked with the Winewater International logo. I watched with a casual interest as the longshoremen loaded crate after crate aboard on pallets, several at a time, and wondered idly how they intended to secure them, as we were not designed for that type of cargo, being an ore hauler. I would later learn they were to be stowed in out-of-way corners on the engineering deck. I was struck by the speed and efficiency with which they loaded them. I had never seen longshoremen work so fast. It's an old joke that they would get in trouble with their union if they did a job without taking at least 3 breaks. Today, however, they moved as if they wanted to get this job done as soon as possible, something I found to be strangely unsettling. What stood out to me about the boxes, however, was what they looked like. Simple wooden crates about 7 feet long by 2 feet wide, and they resembled nothing as closely as they did coffins. Perhaps they were. The thought made me shudder, but it would have explained the longshoremen's attitudes. So I resolved to be there when the captain welcomed the consignor aboard so I could get a better look at her. When she arrived, we were all surprised. We had been told to expect an elderly woman, but the girl who boarded just before sunrise couldn't have been more than 20. She wore a long, conservatively cut dress made of some sort of expensive black fabric I can't name. On anyone else, it would have seemed like a costume. It was just so old-fashioned. But she carried herself with such a confidence that it barely registered as unusual. She walked with surprising speed given the dress, up the gangplank, but stopped dead still before stepping through the hatch, her eyes darting to the captain as she asked, "Permission to come aboard?" in a soft, faintly accented voice. Taking the captain's arm, she stepped over the bulkhead and told us she was the Countess de Charme's granddaughter, and that her dear grandmother had taken suddenly ill and could no longer join us. She showed the captain papers that said as much, and that she was empowered to act as the Countess's agent, and the captain nodded sympathetically. Things were so strange as they were that we didn't question this as much as perhaps we should have. In truth, the others were all upset at the overtime and just wanted to be done and home with their money from this run in their pockets. So they shrugged and welcomed her aboard. I alone voiced questions, and these only later, while I was alone with the captain. As she passed me in the hall, I caught a faint hint of what I took to be an unusual perfume, floral and slightly metallic. It was unpleasant, but I don't, as a rule, question taste. Her dress was unusual too. Outside in the harsh dockside lighting, I had taken it to be all black. But as she passed close to me, I saw that it had a strange swirling pattern all over it in a very thin red thread. So dark it could only be told apart from the black when the light caught it as she moved. The effect was mesmerizing, and I realized I was staring, which embarrassed me, of course, since I did not want her to think I was leering. Still, I found it hard to look away as she passed. As soon as she was aboard, she handed her bags to the kid. as we collectively called any of the cadets from the Maritime Academy who did their internship on the Winewater. She then turned to the captain and asked to see the cargo. Having work of my own to do to get ready for breakfast, I left then and returned to the galley. Around 20 minutes later, Leclerc ducked into my galley and told me not to worry about cooking for our guest. I asked why and made a joke about how I hope she hasn't gone overboard. We shared a small laugh before he explained that, No, Cookie. Our guest was exhausted after several sleepless days of travel. She has elected to just go to bed. I shrugged. One less mouth to feed wouldn't change the calculus of the kitchen all that much. But before Leclerc could leave, I asked him if he would stay a minute while I asked a few more questions. First and foremost was if those boxes had truly been what they looked like, because without a doubt, they looked like one thing and one thing only. He shook his head and said no. While down with Ducharme to inspect them, he had glanced at the customs paperwork stapled to them, which included a manifest stating they were boxes of dirt being shipped to a university laboratory in Alaska, and that they had come from East Germany. This was strange enough, but Leclerc assured me that, look, all the papers are in order, and we've been instructed not to ask any questions. He said that the owners did vouch for her, and they told me we're not doing anything illegal, but they want the secrecy. Unsure of this myself, I remarked that we do have dirt in the States, but the captain told me not to worry about it. You know, it's an old man's job to worry, and I told him as much, but pushed things no further. If only I had. None of the crew saw our guest for the rest of the day until after dinner, when the captain, myself, and a few of the other hands were sitting in the mess hall having a coffee and playing cards. She came in so quietly that it took her clearing her throat just for us to notice her. The captain was apologetic over her having missed 2 meals, and I offered to make her something, but she refused, saying she was on a special diet and I have prepackaged meals in my room. Eventually, the captain did convince her to have a cup of coffee with us at the very least. Now, I thought he was being a bit pushy, but I sensed he wanted to get a better read on her, given how generally strange this whole situation was. She made polite small talk, but said very little. I noticed that she did not appear to enjoy her coffee at all. She only took a few small sips before setting it aside. The weather was calm the next day, as we made our way through Detroit and into Lake Huron. But by late evening, as we were passing by Manitoulin Island, the National Weather Service was warning of a storm brewing ahead of us. With any other captain, I would have been afraid to sail against a storm this late in the season, but Leclerc was to these lakes what Nelson was to Trafalgar. While some of the less experienced crew were clearly nervous, I never feared. Younger than me by about 20 years, I had been a cook on the Allen W. Chambers when Leclerc was just a rookie, and I took him under my wing. We had lost touch for a few years after that, up until he became the captain of the Winewater in the late 60s, where we renewed our friendship. He was one of the very few good captains I have ever known, and he could brave any storm. To whoever is reading this, he would have braved this one too, if not for that thing. Let the record show, when this is investigated, that if he could not save our ship, then no man, dead or alive, could have. And I stake my reputation on that. For breakfast that morning, I made the crew steak and eggs with a side of hash browns. And for our engineer Bubba, this short, broad man from Alabama, I made him a pot of grits. We all ate and talked with an obviously high morale, despite the grumbling about more time away from home from some of the men. A few of the younger men actually pestered me for stories about the old days, which I was more than happy to tell. Then, someone suggested the kid grab his guitar and sing us a song. Now, we all had work to do, but the captain seemed to be in no hurry, and he told him to go ahead. The kid played an old love song and sang with this clear, sweet voice. Look into my eyes, you will see what you mean to me. Search your heart, search your soul, and when you find me there, you'll search no more. That was just 2 days ago, but now I can't even remember the song. So much sorrow has come since. By lunchtime, we were steaming north through the Huron, hugging the Canadian side of the line with the coast of the Bruce Peninsula visible through a light fog to the starboard. The Countess's granddaughter stayed in her room most of the day. However, around 7 p.m., as we were beginning our approach to the Soo Locks at Sault Ste. Marie, I stepped out onto the deck to smoke, and I saw her standing up by the bow. Her head was tilted slightly down, as if in prayer, and despite this innocent act, something about it struck me with a feeling of dread that I could not explain. But it only lasted a moment, and as she turned and began walking back in my direction, the effect was gone. It's only now that I think back, I realized that she had no shadow. I had terrible nightmares that night of distant eyes red as the fires of hell watching me wherever I went, and I woke up covered in cold sweat several times. We traversed the Soo Locks around noon on the 2nd, passing into Lake Superior for the final leg of our journey. By then, the weather had already begun to turn, and I could feel an unease in the air. Walking to my cabin that afternoon to retrieve a book I had been reading, I passed Ducharme speaking with the kid in the hall. While not against the rules, cadets speaking with the VIPs had been known to put their feet in their mouths before, causing problems for the entire crew and their young careers. So, taking it upon myself, the ship's grandfather that I was, I interjected myself to make sure that everything was all right. Ducharme gave a small laugh, instantly seeming to read what I was doing, and she said she'd been asking the kid about his family, just passing time. Not unusual, as they were quite similar in age. That being said, something didn't seem quite right to me. So I took the kid aside, telling Ducharme I needed his help, and I questioned him. He had a weird look about him, slightly glassy-eyed and vacant, which I thought may have just been the result of the ship's rolling motion, which can affect men with weak inner ears, almost like alcohol after enough time. Still, I didn't truly believe that to be the case. I couldn't explain why. He shook himself, seeming to throw off some fog, and blinked at me several times before seeming to get his mental feet under him. But he corroborated her story that they had just been having a casual conversation. I wanted to push further, but I didn't really have a reason to do so, so I dropped it. Of course, now I wish I hadn't. The weather continued to get worse, the wind picking up to a constant whine and a bitter cold slowly creeping in, until by sunset we were sailing through a legitimate storm. The ship rolled on the waves as we steamed towards our destination, which by the charts was about another day from where we were. At dinner, Carlson, the mate, told me in confidence that Leclerc was considering putting in somewhere to wait out the storm, despite the risk that would pose to the bonuses we had been promised for a speedy delivery. That night, the first tragedy of our voyage would strike, but no one would realize until the next morning. I was in the galley discussing the day's menu with the captain when Bubba stuck his head in through the hatch, looking worried. He asked if I could have a minute of the captain's time, and Leclerc nodded, asking him, "What's up, Bubba?" "It's the kid. He wasn't in his bunk this morning." Bubba was his roommate aboard, and this was already unusual as Bubba was the early riser of the pair. It instantly became more concerning when Bubba told us his boots, they were still next to his bed, where he took them off the night before. Leclerc quickly organized a search of the ship, but we found no trace of him. And it soon became obvious that he wasn't on board. Neither was Ducharme, which, while worse, did not upset the crew nearly as much. As soon as we finished the search, Leclerc ordered everyone not doing crucial work to gather in the mess to report on whether they had found anything. Bubba said he had returned to the cabin he shared with the kid to look for any clues to where he might have gone, and looking closer at the kid's bed, he found 2 small bloodstains on his pillow. Not enough to mean anything serious. Just 2 drops, which he said he wouldn't have mentioned except for the kid being missing. Questioning the rest of the crew, nobody had seen anything. Then Red, this large Irish deckhand, came stumbling in looking pale. When we asked him what was wrong, he swallowed and, for a moment, seemed unable to speak. Then, gathering himself with some effort, he admitted that I saw 2 figures walking slowly along the deck that night, and I wrote it off since I only glimpsed them for a moment during the storm. He then described how, for a moment, they seemed like shadows. Then the storm almost bent around them, and they were gone. Upon hearing this, a tragic picture entered my mind unbidden, and I remembered how the kid had been talking with Ducharme. At once, the possibility became clear to me. If the 2 young people had taken to each other and decided to meet in secret on the deck, any number of fates could have befallen them. I knew the kid had been reprimanded for not wearing his safety line before, and if he were with that woman, it all seemed a disturbingly real possibility to me. Going on, Red stated that part of why I hadn't said anything before was the other figure. Its eyes. Them eyes, they were glowing this deep red. They were like distant taillights on the interstate. Leclerc grew angry, a rare sight, and he berated him for not reporting this. "You sad sack, you should have said something." We were all upset, as we'd liked the kid, which was a miracle in and of itself for a cadet aboard a Laker. And to lose a passenger overboard? That might be enough to ruin the careers of all aboard. But we didn't have time for recriminations, and Leclerc knew it. Even as this meeting was going on, we could all feel the storm outside was growing worse. Some of the men accused Red of having been drunk, which he denied, and for my part, I believe him. A storm can do funny things to the eyes. The swirling patterns of rain or snow blowing about make unusual shapes sometimes. And such a momentary hallucination, while strange, was not outside of the realm of possibility. Based on what Red claimed to have seen of the 2 figures, we knew that, if true, they must have gone overboard hours ago. Still, we had to try to help somehow. Leclerc ruled to our dismay that we were unable to safely turn around with the waves knocking us about as much as they were. So, no happier than the rest of us, he resigned himself to call a report into the Coast Guard's Group Sue back at the locks and pray. As the long day dragged on, the accident casting a cloud of gloom over the men, the storm grew worse and worse until 20-foot waves were pounding into the Winewater, tossing us around like a rubber duck in a child's bath. A few years ago, when the Fitzgerald sank, the papers reported that that storm had been the sort only seen every 30 years, and that may be true. But the storm that day, it must have been almost as bad, for the waves were rising like buildings or the walls of a canyon before pounding back down on the deck. Tragic as our losses were, every man aboard knew that we had to work hard to save ourselves, or we could easily join them. When the big waves hit in really bad storms, you'd think man had sinned so bad that the Almighty was going back on his word to Noah and trying to drown us anew. More water than you'd ever seen will rise like a monster from the deep and pound down, covering the deck of your ship. Then just when you'd think it's all over and the ship is sure to sink, she'll pull up again and shake off the water like an old dog. It's a terrible and beautiful sight to see. This was such a storm, and I saw men who I knew had no patience for religion drop down and pray as the ship shuddered beneath their feet. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus." We rode the wild roller coaster ride for what felt like days, though it couldn't have been for more than an hour, before something shifted and we felt things grow calmer, almost imperceptibly around us. There were no cheers, no shouts at this time, only a calm thankfulness masked by bravado, and that in and of itself was short-lived. I made a pot of coffee for the bridge crew once the worst of the storm seemed to be done, and climbed up to the pilot house to give it to them myself. As I made my way through the belly of the ship, An eerie silence seemed to have fallen upon it. The sorrow of the men at our losses, almost a physical presence in the air. It was in that silence that, for a moment, I thought I heard the sound of light footsteps behind me and could have sworn I smelled her terrible perfume. But it was all in my head, as when I turned around, I saw only a key in one of the cabin doors with the other keys on its chain tapping against the metal bulkhead as the ship rocked back and forth, making the sound I had heard. Odd that it was left there, but an ultimately meaningless detail, a simple item overlooked, as we, to our shame, had overlooked the missing people until it was too late. Telling myself to get a grip, I turned and continued on my way. I soon, however, realized, even through the harsh movement of the ship, that we were listing slightly to the port, and I prayed aloud that we weren't taking on any water. As I climbed to the pilot house, I heard a pained sound, like a wounded animal rendered metallic, and the ship seemed to shudder beneath me. Rushing to a porthole, I watched in horror as the safety wire railings along the deck drew taut and then snapped as the boat hogged beneath it. Whether in the storm we had struck something, or the waves had simply been too much, I do not know, but I realized at once that the ship's back was breaking, and soon she must come apart and drown us all. Staring in horror, I could see the seams between the plates of the deck beginning to strain, and a rivet sheared loose. Then one of the hatches to the hold buckled and fell in. This itself could kill everyone on board by allowing enough rainwater in to sink the ship under her weight. Bursting into the pilot house, I saw Leclerc was already well aware of our peril and was shouting orders into a radio. We had but one option to try to save the ship, and it was a desperate gambit. We had to physically pull her back together. It had been done before, but it was tried far more often than it had worked. Leclerc's desperate orders were to run out the lines from our aft winch and anchor them to the back of the pilot house's superstructure, then reel it in as tight as you can. If it worked, it might buy us a few more minutes. And if it failed? Not pausing to question, I ran out into the storm myself to assist. 5 of us wrestled a massive woven steel line from the winch with a strength born of pure desperation. Feet sliding on the frozen deck and wind pushing us like paper dolls. I still can't say how we did it, but we did. And when the line was pulled in, we cheered so loud it could be heard over the wind itself. How bitter the despair of doing the impossible, only to see it fail. Just as we had saved the ship, a horrified cry came from someone on the deck. Who? I am not sure, and all on deck turned to look, transfixed by the wall of water marching towards us. Old as I was, and having seen much and more on these lakes, I was the first to shake off the frozen panic. Running for the pilot house, I had almost made it when the rogue wave struck, taking my feet out from under me with a hammering blow. A monster of a wave, the largest I have ever seen, caught the ship square on her flank, and the entire ship tilted so far, I felt sure she must capsize as I clutched desperately to the railing of the pilot house stairs. That green water, freezing and hard as stone, it slammed over me, and I knew in that moment I was dead. For a seeming eternity, I was within the wave as it washed over the deck and pressed down on me like an elephant's foot on my chest, leaving me twisted and battered against the stairs. Staring desperately around the deck, I saw someone's hand, pale and white and glittering with frozen spray, grabbing tightly to the damaged railing on the side of the ship. For a mad moment, it looked as if they might pull themselves back. But mercy had long abandoned this ship, and I watched in horror as the railing itself gave way, dropping into the lake below. Taken, with the others by the Witch of the Lakes, down to the halls of her ice water castle beneath the surface, and gone forever from the world of the living. Slowly, the ship, almost on its side, began to right itself with a groan that I felt more than I heard. Without thought, I found myself climbing, more like crawling up the stairs. my legs shooting icy lines of fire through my body with every movement. It was broken. Some part of me knew that at once. Then something was grabbing me up under my arms and lifting me as I blacked out. When I came to, moments later, I was in the pilot house with Leclerc kneeling over me, shouting something. I tried to breathe and found myself coughing lake water out onto the deck. The whole world seemed to spin around me, and the air, it was thick as oil as I forced myself to my knees and looked around at what was left of our pilot house. There was blood everywhere, and Carlson, a big Swede who seemed almost invincible, like a Viking god of old, he was dead, his throat torn out by a shard of glass from the smashed windows. The freezing rain blowing in through the windows made Carlson's blood run in an awful swirling pattern on the floor, and unbidden, my mind was drawn back to my first meeting with Ducharme. A broken coffee mug lay on the floor, rolling back and forth as the ship rocked. It left a red track behind it in his blood, like a tally mark counting down the minutes. Trying to make my eyes focus on Leclerc, I saw that he too was wounded. A large cut along his shoulder was turning his shirt crimson, and his arm hung at an odd angle, dislocated. The first words I was able to force out between my frozen lips were a question. Almost a prayer or an invocation. Did the line hold? Aye, Thomas, it holds! The line holds! Our Winewater, while wounded, perhaps even mortally, she was not yet dead, and hysterically I laughed, taunting the storms and the lake, the witch of the wind and the water that I had warred against every day of my working life, who had not yet taken me. After doing what little he could for my leg, Leclerc rose and walked to the wheel, grabbing the mouthpiece of the radio to call out our distress. Mayday! Mayday! This is the Jonathan Winewater! No signal. The wave, it must have smashed the radio equipment into useless scrap and thrown it away like a child in a tantrum discarding a broken toy. If it were at all possible for Leclerc's face to grow more pale than it already was, it did then. But, always quick on his feet, he dropped the radio headset and grabbed the ship's phone to call down to engineering. Leclerc started to demand a report, clinging to professionalism, but then realizing how pointless that was, almost shouted into the phone, begging for Bubba just to answer, just to say he was still alive. After a long moment, he did, Bubba's voice crackling out of the speakers. He reported that
one man is down with a head injury, but everyone else, they're still able to work.
From 15, we were down to just 7 men. What curse was on our ship? I asked myself. What reason was there for so much horror to befall such good and honest men? A little of the tension leaving his body, Leclerc waved me over and, gritting my teeth, I stood and limped to his side, grabbing the wall to keep upright. He told me to hold the ship steady while he spoke with Bubba, saying that if we just keep going in a straight line, we would reach safe harbor in maybe 2 hours. Before everything had gone to hell, he and Carlson had found an old ghost town, Whitby Junction, on the Canadian coast with an abandoned harbor that should have enough shelter to keep us safe. Leclerc spoke urgently with Bubba for a few minutes. Then someone yelled something on the other end, and we both heard Bubba loudly ask them to repeat what they had just said. The captain tried to get him to say what was going on, but no one responded for a few minutes. Then Bubba's voice came back over the line, more worried than before, but also clearly confused. He shouted that one of the boxes had fallen and broken open when the wave hit, and there was a body hanging out of it in a pile of dry dirt. I had been right to think they were coffins, but there was no satisfaction in that now. Then there was another shout, and a voice full of disbelief saying,
He's alive? No, he can't be alive.
We listened as he ordered someone to help whoever had been in the box. His voice was muffled by the phone, so I could not say which one of the men could be heard starting to ask a question.
Is he wearing a...
Before a loud scream filled the line, and we heard Bubba shouting,
Damn it, keep him back!
The line went dead. Stupidly, I wanted to ask what the person in the crates could have been wearing to even be noticeable in a situation like this, as if that even mattered. Leclerc and I stared at each other for a long time, the looks of horror and disbelief on our faces overpowering our pain and sorrow and exhaustion. My mind raced, unsure. Hell, it was unable to comprehend what we had just heard. Leclerc, he took it harder, if that was even possible. I watched his whole body begin to shake, then his face, a mask of pain and concentration. He forced himself to be calm. Finally, with shaking hands, Leclerc told me to stay at the helm, announcing that I have to go below and see what happened. I tried to argue with him, to tell him that he needed to stay here at his post, but looking at his face, I could tell there would be no talking him out of this plan. Still, I couldn't let him go alone. I pleaded for him to send me and stay behind himself. The man had a wife and kids at home. But there was no way I could navigate those stairs and ladders on my leg, and we both knew it. Begging him to take the helm for just one more moment, I limped across the pilot house to the emergency locker. If I couldn't go with him, then I wouldn't let him go unarmed. When I held out the flare gun for him to take, he laughed softly. I think we both knew it would be of little use. Still, he nodded and thrust it into his belt before offering me his hand. I took it, grasping firm a lifeline, and as he turned to leave, he paused for a moment, letting his eyes take in the pilot house for what we both knew would be the last time. A king, surveying his kingdom as the barbarians were at the gates. Then he spoke, very quietly, but with enough force to be heard over the wind and rain. "Cookie," he said, "the ship, she's yours." Then he was gone, his silhouette fading into the haze beyond the doorway. I won't be able to slow the Winewater with the engine crew gone, so my only chance is to beach her. If anyone is reading this, please know we held our own and tell the families of the dead that their loved ones died like sailors. Every one of them was a credit to his profession. The wind is dying now and the rain is starting to fade. Distantly, I can make out the form of the coast. Leclerc said the town was abandoned, but I can see a light. I won't question it. All I can do is thank God it is there and pray it is not another bad omen. Now I tie my hands and hold her true. Goodbye to you all. These chilling final words were written in a much rougher hand, seemingly added later. Rain is gone. I just saw the glow of the captain's flare coming from down on the deck and heard the splash of someone going over. I hear them on the deck. Footsteps, dozens of them, and I can smell her perfume coming up the ladder from below. I should have let her sink. Oh, God save you all. I cannot stop her from reaching shore. I'm sorry. I'm so very sorry. I love it when a story comes together. And that old fool, let me tell you, your stories never disappoint. This one, wow, it really came together. I absolutely loved the setting of this. It's on a boat during a storm where it's a life or death situation. It's starting to fall apart, and the sailors need to try to keep the ship from being scuttled. But it appears there is a monster on board that's picking them off one by one. That really gave me some alien vibes, and I absolutely loved it. But also, what really was the deal with Ducharme? Why did she decide she wanted to take this ship and all that cargo with her, only to start killing everybody off? What was her actual intention? That got me thinking about Whitby Junction, because Leclerc and his first mate, they stated that it was an abandoned ghost town. But at the end of the story, our cook, Thomas Faegen, he actually sees a bright light coming from Whitby Junction as he's sailing the ship towards it. Well, maybe Ducharme was actually trying to get her coven to a vampire colony that's out in the Canadian wilderness. That in and of itself sounds like it would be worthy of a sequel that I think a lot of people would be really interested in seeing. But speaking of sequels, there's already a sequel to this story. That Old Fool told me about U666, and it follows our writer as he's once again exploring a maritime mystery, this time following a German U-boat that sank in 1945. It sounds like a story that's right up my alley, and I would love to do it. That is, if I'm allowed to do it after singing in this story. Well, we're on to other things now, but at some point I'm sure we'll be sailing back into port to see what That Old Fool has cooked up for us next. Now, in the meantime, I've been working on a special video. It's work I'm doing in the background. I'm still not sure when it's going to be coming out yet, but let me tell you, let's just say we're going to be entering into the Smoodiverse. That's right. So my book club last month decided that the guys aren't getting enough spice in their reading, so they wanted to do something a little more smutty. Well, we ended up settling on How to Kill a Guy in 10 Dates. How to Kill a Guy in 10 Dates. And let me tell you, if you like slashers, and you like rom-coms, and you like to see how two seemingly incompatible genres can mix together to form a menagerie of chaos, bloodshed, and romance, well then this is the book for you. And don't tell the boys, but I actually really kind of liked this story. Well, anyways, in the meantime, be sure to check back at the channel to find some of the creepy stories that I'm working on and to get a couple thrills in. All right, everybody, that's it for tonight. Peace!